Hello and welcome everybody to another Healthy Living live stream. My name is Alexander Raskovich, and today's topic is calories in food, scientific or utter nonsense. Now, if you're somebody like me who has been keeping track of calories for quite some time, in the past that is, and for like a certain diet plan or something, then you might be in for a treat today. And because calories might not be as relevant as might not be as relevant as we think. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Andrew Kaufman.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living live stream. Many claims which we accept as fact all our lives without ever questioning them, when looked into carefully, turn out to be more akin to folklore. And the claim that the food calorie is relevant to our body's energy management systems, also known as metabolism, or our body's weight control system, is such a folkloric claim. And let me explain. So, first of all, the calorie is a unit of heat, and it's defined as the amount of heat or heat energy that it takes to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree centigrade. And it is generally, when in food, it's actually kilocalories that they're referring to. And that would be the amount of heat to raise 1 kilogram of water 1 degree centigrade. And the application of this unit of heat was first applied to food in the United States by a man named Wilbur O. Atwater, who published in, I believe, Century Magazine in 1887. And he learned about this from German researchers who had began applying this type of analysis to food 7 years earlier in 1880. Now, here's the interesting thing. Their method of using calories as a measurement of the energy or heat of food was based upon the methods to analyze fuel. Now, we know fuel is burned or exploded to generate mechanical energy. Like, for example, that's the way engines or motors work in our vehicles. But this was applied to the food. However, there was no validation that this measurement of heat in food was actually related to the body's reaction to eating. And it was just really just assumed to be the case. And I want to bring your attention, Alexander, if you could bring up the first slide, to this paper that I found about the history of the food calorie. And I want to read you this quote. The thermal calorie, which is, as a unit of heat, was not fully defined until the 20th century, by which time the nutritional calorie was embedded in US popular culture and nutritional policy. So, in other words, they didn't even have an accepted definition of the calorie as a unit for heat, the so-called thermogenic calorie, but they already had policies using food calories to determine nutritional guidelines and recommendations, but it was not based on science since there wasn't even a definition yet. So let's talk about how food calories are actually determined. Like for a particular food, how do we say how many calories are in that food? So what they do is they take the food and then they completely dehydrate it. So there's no water in it. And then they put it into a device called a food calorimeter. And this is a closed device, and it has a water bath in it, which they put a vessel that contains the dried food that they're going to measure. And the water goes into a spiral tube like a condenser. And there are temperature probes in there to measure the starting and the ending temperature of the water, because what you're going to do is burn the food. So there has to be a high oxygen environment inside this chamber for all the food to ignite and burn. Because, if we try to light food on fire, for example, in standard conditions, it won't burn completely. But this high oxygen environment allows that to happen. And they burn the food, they ignite it with an electrical coil, and then measure how much the water rises in temperature. And it's, of course, a known volume of water. And this determines how many calories in the food. So we have a demonstration here of how this is done. Now, this is not in a food calorimeter, but this is the same reaction that was done. So Alexander, if you want to cue that up. And this is with cheese puffs. And you can see quite a lot of heat is generated if you want to run that film now.
Go ahead and light up your torch again.
All right.
So this is the comparison. This is the cheese puffs. Let me get the oxygen in there. Go ahead and hit them. Hold it there for a second. Okay, pull back.
Oh, wow.
Okay, see, that's why I brought the fire extinguisher as well.
Sure.
Incredible amount of energy coming off those cheese puffs.
You can feel the heat from that.
You can feel it. You can see it.
All right, so you can see from that demonstration how we can determine, the amount of heat or calories, units of heat, would be associated with those cheese puffs. And you can see that by lighting it on fire. Now, if we were analyzing fuel, right, like gasoline or kerosene or jet fuel or something like that, and we did this experiment, it would be directly relevant to the application because we're going to actually ignite that fuel in those machines. But when it comes to food, when we eat those cheese puffs, and I'm not, of course, encouraging anyone to eat those cheese puffs, but if we were to eat them, would they ignite on fire inside our stomach or small intestine? And of course, the answer is no. So how can this measurement possibly be relevant to food? So I found the answer, and there's something called diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is something that was characterized later as a physiologic principle, but has been applied in various scientific studies to the food calorie. And let me read you the definition from this article. Diet-induced thermogenesis usually is defined as the increase in metabolic rate, heat production, associated with acute ingestion of food and increases in post-absorptive heat production during chronic hyperphagia. Chronic hyperphagia is chronic overeating. Okay, but here the definition is essentially we eat a meal and then our body produces heat as a result of that meal, right? So that is the direct equivalent of, is the heat energy in the food converted to thermal energy in the body? So if you want to bring up the next slide, here is an example of one study looking at the relationship between the calories in a food of a meal and the amount of thermogenesis, which they can measure in laboratory studies. And there are many studies with similar results, but I'm just going to highlight this study. And if you look at the bottom of the abstract on page 2, what it says here in quotes is diet-induced thermogenesis is clearly higher in the morning and the evening, irrespective of the consumed calorie amount. So you could see there's changes in the amount of heat produced by the body in response to a meal, but it's not related to the amount of calories in the meal. Instead, it's related to the time of day in this study. And there are other factors like the composition of the meal that may affect the amount of thermogenesis, but it's not the number or amount of calories. So here we see that it's shown that first of all, that the food calorie was first conceptualized and applied to policy and popular culture based on an assumption that if we burn food and measure how much heat is produced, that means something about how that food supplies energy to our body. But later on, when we discovered about diet-induced thermogenesis as the way our body produces heat in relation to eating food, we see that there's no relationship with the food calories. And this is the reason why following certain calorie recommendations does not result in the right outcome. And you can also find lots of studies where calories did not result in the weight loss in everybody, because some people respond to food very differently, and it's not based on calories. So that leaves us with some very big questions about biology. And one is, well, if the calories are not directly converted in food, then do they actually supply the energy to our body? And if not, where does the energy come from? So I want to take a closer look at one of the biggest energy consumers in our physiology, which is known as the resting membrane potential, or sometimes it could be referred to as a voltage. And what this is, that every cell of our body has a membrane or a boundary around it. And on the inside of that boundary, inside the cell or the cytoplasm, there is a buildup of negative charge. But immediately outside that boundary in the extracellular environment, there is an excess of positive charge. And this charge difference represents a membrane potential or a voltage. And we know that for cells to be living and in good health, they have to maintain a certain level of that voltage. And if the health is diminished, like, say, for example, in certain cancers, and we've measured this experimentally, we can see that this voltage is significantly reduced. And we know that in dead tissue, that the voltage will be zero. Now, the theory that is widely accepted in biology about how our cells maintain this voltage is through something called the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, now this is supposedly a specific protein pump that's in the membranes of our cells that exchanges sodium and potassium ions at different amounts and establishes this voltage. Now, this supposedly takes quite a bit of energy because it has to overcome both the concentration gradient of concentration of sodium ions being higher on one side than the other side and wanting to equalize, and also the osmotic pressure that the water on either side of this membrane boundary wants to flow across, also to equalize the overall osmolality or the concentration of solutes in the water. And so that this pump has to overcome those energetic forces, and therefore it needs ATP. And we're told that ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy that our cells use to drive chemical and other processes that require energy, like this membrane potential with this ion pump. And of course, ATP is generated from food. We metabolize food through oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria of our cells, and that generates ATP. And we're told in basic biochemistry that ATP is the main energy source for all of our cells' functions, the membrane potential being one of them, but also every other chemical function that goes on in the cell. So, is it possible that this theory is correct? Well, that brings us to Gilbert Ling, who is a biologist and a scientist who has time and time again debunked this theory about the sodium and proton pump on the cell membranes. And the basic disproving technique that he used here, or one of them, is that he did a calculation, and he determined how much ATP would be required according to this theory to maintain the resting membrane potential using the sodium potassium pump. And then he compared that to the amount of ATP that could be generated by a typical cell with the amount of mitochondria that are contained in a typical cell, and data about how much ATP the mitochondria could generate. And what he showed was that there's actually not enough ATP to drive this process and any other processes. So there has to be another explanation. This is completely disproven. Let me say that again, that our cells cannot generate enough ATP energy to possibly maintain this voltage in our cells and also drive any other normal chemical processes that require ATP. So there has to be another explanation. Where does the energy come from that maintains the voltage in all our cells? And we know that this is critical for life. So that brings us to the topic of structured water. Now, Gerald Pollack is the scientist who is most well known for popularizing and publishing serious scientific studies in the physical chemistry space about these novel properties of water. So water has been taught to us as just being a passive solvent in the background, right? The universal solvent that dissolves all of the substances practically in living organisms, makes up 99 out of 100 molecules in our body, and about 70% of our body weight is water. Now, it turns out that water actually has special, unique, and quite amazing properties, actually, that it can form a different phase, so to speak. So not just, liquid water, ice, and water vapor, but actually a fourth phase of water known as structured water, or EZ. And EZ water means that it's called exclusion zone because certain things in the water are excluded from water that comes near certain types of surfaces, which are found in biological organisms. They're known as hydrophilic surfaces. And this would be things like the inside of our blood vessels, for example. And what happens is that as a result of this exclusion zone, water can actually cause charge separation and create a voltage. And this can happen based upon the energy from sunlight. And it's specifically the infrared spectrum of sunlight that has been shown to drive this process. So if we take water, put it next to a hydrophilic surface, which there are many of in our body, and apply sunlight, we actually get a voltage. So he had the idea, could this property of water to create a voltage actually be the mechanism that drives our voltage in our cells? So he did this experiment, and you can bring up the last slide now, where he created sort of an artificial cell membrane boundary. Now, in the title of the article, it says he used a hydrogel, but this is not a synthetic bioweapon hydrogel that you may have heard about. This is actually the cell wall of an algae that has a hydrophilic material that it's made of. I believe it's a carbohydrate, and it has pores or channels in it that both water and ions like sodium and potassium can freely diffuse or move across. And he set up a system with using these hydrogel membranes as an artificial boundary and put different concentrations of the electrolytes on both sides of the membrane in water. But what was not included in this experiment is that there were no sodium potassium ion pumps because they're not present in the cell walls of algae. And secondly, there was no ATP in this experiment. However, this experiment was able to show that without those forms of energy and without the sodium potassium pumps, that he was able to establish a membrane potential and a concentration gradient and overcome the concentration gradient and the osmotic pressure in this system, which the only source of energy was infrared light, which easily penetrates through walls and is pretty much ubiquitous in our environment. So what we've seen here is that at least one source of energy that our bodies use most likely is simply the sunlight. And we don't really know actually if our bodies get energy from food or if food is used for other things. Now, certainly you can reason that food is used to actually build our bodies, right? Build new tissues because it's the only source of matter that we put in. But we have to really question where the energy in our body comes from, because we know at least for some processes, in fact, the most energy intensive process in our cells, it seems that it comes from the sunlight. So today I have debunked the relationship of food calories as being representative of something that actually happens in our body in relation to eating. And I've showed you this, that they were conceived just based on unproven assumptions. And later on, when they were able to test this theory about heat from food, they showed no relationship between calories and the heats our body produce after a meal. And we then looked at what is the source of energy driving the biological processes in our body, and found out that it actually may not come from food necessarily at all, but certainly seems highly likely that the sunlight, specifically in the infrared spectrum, is at least driving some of our biological processes. In fact, some of the most important. So, where do we go for here? I'd like to leave you with one action step that you can take to more appropriately determine how much food you should eat to maintain optimal health. And certainly, we can talk at length about the types of food or other things that really shouldn't be considered food that you might want to avoid. But how much to eat is still an important question. So, the action step is to learn how to recognize your body's satiety, when you actually have had enough to eat. And this means you're going to have to, one, slow down your eating, fully chew your food, appreciate all the sensory aspects of the food. And this gives your body a little bit of time to figure out what you've just eaten and give you some feedback about the response. And mindful eating is one technique you might investigate where you can achieve this. And then you have to pay attention to the body's signals of satiety, when you actually feel that you've eaten enough to satisfy the body's cravings for food, which we, do need, at least in our current state, but to not go beyond that point and end up stuffing yourself and giving the body excess, which can cause indigestion and, lots of other problems down the road. So let's start paying attention to our body, learning when we're full, and let that, rather than arbitrary food calories, guide us to better health. Alexander, you're muted.
Excuse me, Andy. Thank you so much for that action step at the end. That was a fascinating presentation. Let's move on to some questions. The first question from Mindy: how do you feel about counting macros as opposed to counting calories?
Yeah, well, this certainly has to do with, the actual content and the value of nutrition in the food you're eating, and it's a very different thing. I will say something interesting about macros, though, because there are essentially three macronutrients that we're talking about here. Proteins, which, of course, are not all created equal, fats, and carbohydrates. And it's been shown that only two of those are essential for us to survive. And those are fats and proteins. So we can actually live and survive, and many will say quite healthfully, without carbohydrates at all.
All right, great. Another question from Sarsaparilla. So, would structured water possibly help with neuropathy?
Well, structured water is something that our bodies need in order to survive, right? So within our bodies, our body has the natural ability to turn, non-structured water, right, which we could call denatured water or bulk water, into structured water, because it exposes it to hydrophilic surfaces, right? And then two, the energy source of infrared light is ubiquitously present. So we have the necessary conditions. Now, if you drink structured water, in other words, you structure water before you put it in your body, this may give a health benefit. It's not definitively proven yet, but are some very interesting studies. Some of these are done by Dolph Lundgren. Did I say his name? Dolph Zantinga. Sorry. I was confusing him with a movie star, but Dolph Zantinga, who is the inventor of the Analemma water wand, and he and his associates have conducted and also contracted out several studies. So they've showed, for example, that when you give rainwater to tomatoes that are grown in a greenhouse, and you structure that rainwater or leave it unstructured to different groups of tomatoes, that you have superior growth and harvest yield in the tomatoes given the structured water. He's also done a lot of studies looking at biophotons, showing that you have more of a broader spectral expression and higher intensity of biophotons when the seeds are exposed or germinated in structured water. And there are some preliminary human studies looking at some biomarkers and looking at the microbiome of people drinking structured water versus unstructured water that show some good preliminary evidence of health benefits from doing that. So it's something that certainly I don't think has any potential for harm, and very likely has health benefits. So I do overall recommend it.
All right, excellent answer. Here's a question from Marlet. How much sunlight is needed for optimal energy?
Well, the thing about this is that infrared light can penetrate, through matter quite readily, and so it's present, really day and night, almost everywhere. If you want to do an experiment without infrared light, you have to kind of go to great lengths to shield something from it using special materials that does not penetrate. So you don't. This is not like for vitamin D where you need direct sunlight on your skin. Pretty much everywhere you are, you're getting exposure to infrared light. But there also is some interesting evidence of using infrared and near infrared light for different therapeutic purposes. So there's some researchers in, I believe, Brazil who have looked at this for athletic performance and have found some significant benefits. And also we know about infrared saunas, which can help with detox and are used in some cancer therapies, et cetera. So getting increased intensity of infrared light may have some therapeutic benefit as in addition to the normal background exposure.
All right, that's great. And a question from Cheryl: how do we get enough infrared, how do we get enough infrared sunlight when we live in Pennsylvania?
Just by being in Pennsylvania, you get it. So pretty much no matter where you live, you're getting enough infrared light. And let me just once again differentiate this from how your body makes vitamin D. This is a different spectrum of light and different types of exposure.
All right. Then another question from let's go to Zygmunt Mike. Why might animals like horses, cows, deer, and birds seemingly spend their whole day eating and grazing?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly how it's related to our discussion today, but it's much more difficult to digest those grasses, right? That they have a different process that goes on in ruminant animals where they actually ferment those grasses, right, in one stomach into something into nutrients that are absorbable by the animal, right? Because animals couldn't just absorb the nutrients out of the grasses directly, and that process is energy intensive, it's inefficient, and it takes time. Also just think about like animals like a gorilla, for example, right? Gorillas are huge. They weigh quite a bit, right? Hundreds and hundreds of pounds. I don't want to quote an exact weight because I don't know, but they eat leaves, right, predominantly, but leaves are very, very light, right? So they have to eat so many leaves, and then they have a similar process of fermentation in their gut in order to absorb the nutrients, and they just need a large amount of biomass in order to extract enough nutrition to meet whatever their needs are. But I think if we did any kind of analysis, we'd see that it wasn't related to the calories in those leaves that we would calculate based on burning them. That if there's energy, from our food, that there's got to be a different way of measuring what it is, and that actually relates to our body's physiology.
All right, final question Is there any truth to the idea that eating is not necessary to live, i.e., breatharianism, such as hermits and mystics who stop ingesting food?
Yeah, well, so this is something that's quite intriguing for me, and I haven't spent a lot of time researching it in depth, but I did think about bringing this up today because it is certainly an example that would confirm that whatever source of energy we need to drive our body's processes, that it must not exclusively come from food. So breatharians, I'll just give you a brief introduction. What they are people who have gone through some kind of process that they stopped eating and in some cases stopped drinking, but can still survive and maintain health, and just based on breathing. Now, this might seem unbelievable and mystical. However, at least one individual who was doing this uh, agreed to go into a hospital in India under strict medical supervision, without being able to leave for a period of months to be observed, so that we could see, oh, is this actually true? Can they actually survive, without eating or drinking? And this occurred, and the individual did survive, and it's documented, so you can find evidence about that. And it's definitely on my list of things to investigate further. And one day I hope to actually perhaps have an interview with someone who has achieved this and learn more about it.
Right. That was excellent, Andy. Thank you so much for all the beautiful insights during those questions and the beautiful presentations. So many paradigm shifts over the last 3 weeks that we've been doing this, and we will continue to do many more. Speaking of which, we will be back next Wednesday at 12 p.m. at noon. And the replay of this specific live stream will be available later today. And we will look forward to seeing you then. Any closing remarks, Andy?
Yes, I want to remind everyone that I have a quiz called Learning What's Getting in the Way of Your Freedom. And I think it's a very helpful resource and a way for people to get introduced to all of my content and other resources out there. So please check either in the show notes below or go to my page, and in the Linktree, you'll find a link to that quiz, and you will get a free resource, the Natural Medicine Cabinet, which contains some very useful materials and some bonus protocols to help you and your family stay healthy. So don't forget to go ahead and take that quiz.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time. Cheers.
See you next week.